Well, I'm Lue Elizondo. I'm a Gemini. I like long walks on the beach. No, sorry. Yeah, my name's Lue. I spent a good portion of my career with the United States government, within the intelligence community and national security apparatus. Worked for a lot of different agencies, fill in the blank. Spent some time in combat, in some war zones, and had the privilege to work with some amazing human beings. 2008, I was asked to be part of another effort, initially to set up the security and counterintelligence apparatus for the program that is now known as ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And in 2010, I was asked to lead the effort. I did so with my colleagues, until about 2017, October to be precise, when I resigned. I resigned my position out of protest over excess secrecy of this topic, of the UAP topic. And the rest is kind of pretty much history, so they say.
I'm David, I'm a Virgo. I've investigated UFOs and historical research for 32 years, albeit in the civilian sector, unlike Lue, and have collected and amassed one of the largest historical UFO case file collections, as well as collections of historical materials and UFO government documents, and have actively worked in the UFO field for that entire time, and I'm based here in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
We're in Albuquerque?
What was that?
We're in Albuquerque?
Albuquerque.
Albuquerque. So my name is Alejandro Rojas, and I have been working in this field for about 20 years. I've been a freelance journalist, but I've also worked with MUFON as doing public relations. I was their spokesperson for a period of time. Then I worked for Open Minds magazine and OpenMinds.tv, where we did a lot of digital content and journalistic kind of coverage of this topic. And then I've done other freelance writing in science and sci-fi, but UFO stuff is the most popular. Been in all kinds of TV shows, interviews, things like that. Now, I am a paid UFO researcher. So I'm a UFO head of research and content for a software company, where we're developing an app where we can take sighting reports and track them, and we've got AI that will evaluate the cases for us to tell us what are the good cases and bad cases. And it's pretty exciting, because when we get this up and rolling here in the next few months, we'll be able to do some real serious analysis of the sightings. We've gotten tons of different databases. We're even getting more databases of sightings plugged into this software. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm also a board member and public relations director for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Research, a group of scientists and other engineers and tech people who have been looking at this topic and researching it for decades.
And I'm Bryan Bender. I'm senior national correspondent for Politico. And my background is as a national security journalist. I never wrote one thing about UFOs in 20 plus years of covering the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies until 2017, where the Gemini down on the end there decided he had a story to tell. And a lot of my career I've covered government secrecy. And by that I mean not so much trying to get the government to cough up secrets. In other words, what are you doing today, and can you tell me about it if you're not supposed to? But more looking at the historical picture of why the government keeps secrets. I also spent a good amount of time as a news reporter covering what I would call history as news. In other words, government archives that would come out many years later about events that would shed new light on, we thought it happened this day. But now we have a new archive that's now public that was classified or secret that sheds new light on. And I did a lot of that when I was a reporter at the Boston Globe for about 15 years, covering the Pentagon, also covering some of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So tonight, the topic, as you know, of this discussion is government secrecy, which
We can't talk about it.
Because if you talk about it, we can't talk about it. But we can really go in a lot of different directions. But I thought it might be helpful to start off, and obviously we're talking about this in the context, a subject that is not only secret, but is also mysterious, confusing. Even what we know about the topic, it isn't secret. That is government information. It isn't always black and white or very clear what we're actually looking at. And so to start it off, I would like to hear from the panelists. First, what would be their relatively basic, simple answer to why the government keeps secrets? Number one, whether it's about UFOs or anything else, you as somebody who's actually spent their life in that secret world, why does our government keep secrets?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why our government keeps information secret, classified. And in essence, in the U.S. architecture, there's three classifications of information. There is what we call confidential information, and then there is secret information, and then there is top secret information. And of course, we all watch Hollywood, and we think we have these ideas of what classified information is and isn't, but in reality, it's defined pretty precisely. Now, you can look early this afternoon, I kind of gave a brief description. You can look at Webster's dictionary or the Oxford dictionary and find your definition du jour, but in reality, there's some very specific legal connotations within the U.S. government, covered by several executive orders, EOs, that prescribe precisely what is classified information. And the reason why we as a nation classify information, there's really a few reasons. The first one is to ensure that our nation's most sensitive assets, if you will, remain within the control of our nation. They are not compromised. You spend a lot of money, your taxpayer money, whether you realize it or not, to create new technologies, new capabilities, and new advantages for our country. And it is advantageous of us to keep that information out of the hands of our adversaries. And unfortunately, there's no way to have that conversation with the American people and say, hey, look at all our classified stuff, just don't tell the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else is our adversary for this week, and keep that information protected. So that's one reason why you keep information protected, to protect what we call sources and methods. Okay, so sources are, how'd you get the information? Something that Bryan here can talk to you about as a journalist, professional journalist, right? Always protect your source. But also the method in which you collected that information. A lot of times these methods are very, very sensitive. They're very, very expensive. And they are, they're equities that we don't want to lose to a foreign adversary. And so I guess that's probably the quickest way to answer. We're not really supposed to classify information in order to protect our nation from embarrassment. That's not what we're supposed to do. Sometimes that process, though, does get abused, Bryan. And so that's where people like you come in to expose that, right? Where are we classifying things that maybe we shouldn't classify, shouldn't be classified, because maybe we're embarrassed about something, or maybe somebody did something maybe they shouldn't, so we put a classification on it to protect either that information or those people. And that's where some of those abuses occur.
So maybe the same question for David. Why does the government keep secrets? And maybe let's narrow it down a little bit to why the government keeps secrets about this particular phenomenon.
Absolutely.
You've spent so much time researching.
No, it's a great question, and approaching it from a different angle, from a civilian UFO researcher standpoint. I have attended UFO conferences since 1990, when I first got involved in this, sitting in the audience much like yourself. And I would consistently hear the same narrative being told by UFO enthusiasts, UFO quote-unquote researchers, where they say the government knows. The government knows, and they're covering it up. And first off, I have a lot of issues unpacking that statement. I love when people say the government. Which branch? Which division? Which office? They act like it's this cohesive body working together, and I think Lou could probably regale us with stories of how dysfunctional the organization is, the government. I work for a large hospital network, and quite often you don't have the pieces all working together. And the government, the United States, any other government, each group is vying for limited resources. So I think it's a false narrative to say the government is covering this up. But I'll go one step further, Brian, to your question. Everyone usually assumes the government is covering it up based on the knowledge that they have. I take a contrary position. I think Alejandro and I have talked about this privately many times. I think the historic quote-unquote cover-up has been based on ignorance, not knowledge. You are paying your tax dollars for the military, the intelligence communities to defend you against enemies, both foreign and domestic. We have this UFO subject that has been facing us since at least 1947. I'll be talking about a case tomorrow even prior to that. But what if they're being faced with a phenomenon that they A, can't identify, don't know the source or origin of it, and don't know the agenda? Do you really think that they're going to admit their ignorance in relation to all of those issues? And my answer is no. So, as I stated in my book, if you can't control the phenomenon, you control the perception of the phenomenon, and I would go even one step further. You control the narrative as it relates to your knowledge regarding the subject. No government is going to admit their ignorance because by virtue of that, you're admitting that you're impotent with regard to defending against that.
Yeah, Brian, can I add one thing to that? Please. So there's a very, I think, a really good example that I like to use a lot that really highlights what my colleague here is saying. And in the 1960s and the late 1950s, the CIA, working with then Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, had spent several $1 million developing the U-2 spy aircraft. Now, let's look at this, what was going on at the time. We were in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we had a treaty in place that we would not fly manned reconnaissance missions over mainland Russia. And what were we doing? Well, we were doing exactly that. And so we were flying these U-2 aircraft, and this plane was designed to fly so high and so fast that the Russians would never be able to catch it. In fact, so high and so fast, they probably wouldn't even be able to see it. And so for several missions, we kept flying this U-2 aircraft over mainland Russia. And it wasn't until the Soviets were successful in shooting down, the famous, of course, with the pilot, Mr. Powers, shoot down one of our U-2 aircraft with an SA-2 surface-to-air missile, that Russia actually admitted we were flying the aircraft over Russia. It wasn't until Russia had a solution to that problem did they wind up admitting to their own citizens, and in fact the world, what we were doing. In essence, if you don't have a solution, you're better off not admitting there's a problem.
Well, let's turn to, by the way, Captain Salas, we're glad to see you didn't get abducted. We're glad to see you didn't get abducted. I would love to hear your perspective as a former Air Force officer at a nuclear missile base that clearly witnessed, experienced an incident that is, I think most would agree, among the most credible in the realm of UFOlogy. And you were told to keep it secret. Why do you think in that particular case, something that either was unknown or unexplained, that exhibited powers, if you will, that couldn't easily be explained, why would the government be so concerned to not reveal that? Is it for the reasons that Lou just laid out? In other words, we don't know what it is, so we don't want to talk about it?
I didn't hear all of Lou's answer, but in my case, the secret had to do, I think, primarily with the fact that the Condon investigation was ongoing. And the Condon investigation was a setup. It was a setup by the Air Force in order to avoid reporting to the public on UFOs. It began in I think November of '66. My incident occurred in March of '67. So the high secrecy over my incident, the Echo Flight incident, I think had to do primarily with not allowing the Condon investigators to thoroughly investigate those incidents so that they could put in their report that there was no national security interest in the Air Force to keep continuing to study this thing. And that gave them an out. So
So it was a can of worms that they, at that point, had even more reason not to open because they were creating an narrative.
Right. And they didn't want to keep, the Air Force didn't want to keep talking to the public about UFOs. Project Blue Book, which was an open, source. They just didn't want to have to report to the public, try to explain the many incidents that occurred, seen by many people, many law enforcement people, many military people, and they knew, of course, that this was a real phenomenon. They just didn't want to have to discuss it publicly, keep those secrets.
So maybe for you, Alejandro, the question, let's flip it a little bit, should be, what do you think in your research is perhaps maybe the most interesting example of something that was secret about UFOs that is not secret, either because it leaked out, or the government reported it, or for some other means got out?
It's funny because, you asked that question, and normally I'm kind of, conservative about the idea of secrecy. So for example, I think Lue outlined some good reasons why we would want to hide things from enemies. I think that, Robert's situation, for example, highlights a situation why we might want to keep secrets from ourselves. So for example, a lot of us were shocked. I had a couple of articles out there where I was complaining when the hearings, when they were asked about the nuclear issue, they said, oh, we don't know anything about that. And all of us know who have been into this topic for a while know that that's a big issue. That, of course, the Maelstrom issue, which came up in the hearings, was an important and credible situation. There's others, like Robert had talked about earlier today. And not only that, the way that the files are tagged has allowed us researchers to FOIA these documents. So we know in the 80s and 90s, when allegedly they weren't doing any UFO research, that these nuclear incursions were happening. And of course, that's a big concern. Now, for instance, at the SCU, we've done some pattern analysis with some of the databases that we've manually swept to get the good cases. And I think what we're seeing here is that we have seen more sightings at nuclear facilities, especially when weapons are being developed. We've still got some work on that, but it's starting to look fairly solid that we can justify or demonstrate that. If that's something that the government knows or the military has assessed, should they keep it secret? That's the hard part, is if you're them and you want to tell the public that we're having these incursions over nuclear facilities, or we're even having during these sighting events, missiles going offline, that's a pretty scary situation. And kind of like Lou outlined earlier, or even David talked about, do we want to admit something when we don't know? But, putting on kind of the other hat with what's going on here and getting back to those hearings, we hear a lot about the cases with Project Blue Book or going up to Project Blue Book. They acknowledged ATIP and the work they're doing, and I think Lou made this point earlier, but what about those years in between? And really, those years in between, we were being gaslighted. We were being told that we don't, as us as researchers and journalists, I got so many times back the email when I would make inquiries, the whole 1969, we did the Condon report, we found out there's nothing to this, we haven't cared about UFOs since. That's just patently false. Even when we can say, look, I have a government document right here where you all were very concerned. There's situations where you inquired Iran or other countries and you said, hey, you guys had a UFO situation, tell us about this. Obviously they were concerned. So we were gaslighted for decades. And I think that is something that the media hasn't totally come to terms with. At the point yet, it's not a topic, and it should be. It was the first thing I wrote after the 2017 came out was, okay, the government's admitting they've been gaslighting us for decades. So I guess that would be the answer to the question, is what has come out is that they have been interested. The Navy, luckily, due to the work of really Chris and what Lue had done to get this out, kind of cornered and the Navy was the first to come out and say, okay, our Navy guys did see something, and we do take this topic seriously. Duh, we knew that, but now they're finally admitting that, but they haven't acknowledged that. One, they've been gaslighting us for decades, and two, sorry Navy, you're coming out and you're being the hero now, and it's wonderful that you're admitting this, but where have you been in the last few decades? At least the Air Force was there up until 1969, but the Navy's been one of the most secretive areas. So, there's been a lot of these secrets. It's great things are coming out and they're taking it serious, but they still really haven't acknowledged that, they were doing us wrong for many years.
I've asked that question too a number of times. The in-between years, if you will, sort of gap that there seems to be. And I don't know that I would say gaslighting. I mean, I think you could look at it that way. There's no doubt that what they were telling us was not the truth. However, I do think the government, as Lue knows and others know, does this all the time. But it's this very careful wording. If the question is, if you had a comprehensive military-wide investigation into the phenomenon, a la Project Blue Book, the accurate answer is no. That doesn't mean that Command X or Command Y or General so-and-so didn't order his people to go look into something that emerged, citing. And so I'm not defending the government, but I do think they've used that as sort of their out. That's their crutch. Well, we don't have to talk about it because there wasn't really any formal program going on. Well, we all know that's basically a lie because we have all this government paper trail that shows that there was a mining interest in some of these cases for a long time. Which brings me to my next question for the panel, which is, if we're assuming, as Lue alluded to and others, that the government's secrecy on UFOs is more out of ignorance than it is knowledge. In other words, we're not hiding all the family jewels. It's the fact that we don't really know what we're looking at. So we don't really want to talk about it. How much do you all think the government is sitting on information or data, whether it's images, whether it's other kinds of intelligence, that are really big pieces to the puzzle? In other words, they may not have the whole picture, but I think we all can agree we think there are puzzle pieces all over the place that in isolation might not mean anything, but together with some other pieces would illuminate the bigger picture. Is there puzzle pieces like that? Or is it all really, really, I mean, I guess my question is it a 500-piece puzzle and there's 20 pieces? Or is it a 10,000-piece puzzle and, there's 2 pieces? Lue doesn't want to answer.
I'm probably going to pull it past that. That's a great question. What I don't want to do is
Go to jail.
that for sure. And I don't want to prejudice the jury. The U.S. government is finally in a position now where it is looking at this problem holistically and comprehensively. And a lot of due diligence must be performed in a relatively short period of time. Why? Because you demand it. And when you demand it, Congress demands it. So there is a tremendous amount of pressure right now, like I have never seen before, on elements within the U.S. government and the executive branch. And so the first thing they're going to have to do is first pulse the entire system. Okay? Who knows what? 2, you have to pulse the system going back in the past. Who knew what? And in order to do that, you're going to have to offer some sort of get out of jail free card, some sort of amnesty. Remember when we used to play Monopoly and do a card and go directly to jail? Well, this conversation is very much like that. There are some secrecy oaths that were taken, some national security oaths that people still take to this day very, very seriously. And so in order to alleviate that responsibility so people aren't afraid of going to jail, being either persecuted or prosecuted, we are going to have to offer some sort of amnesty. And you hear me talking in circles around this, right? I'm not answering your question directly because I can't. I cannot share with you, ironically enough, what your taxpayer dollars paid me to do. I can't tell you because I will get in trouble. So at the end of the day, we have to let Congress do what Congress does best and ask the hard questions and hold people accountable and hopefully create some sort of amnesty legally that allow people to come forward, and folks like Mr. Salas here, people can finally take that information and take it seriously because it deserves to be taken seriously.
But when you say come forward, just to put a little finer point on this, you don't necessarily mean publicly. You mean to be able to contribute to that bigger mosaic that Congress wants put together, as opposed to come forward and tell the world, here's everything I know about UFOs.
Well, I would love it to be public, but that's not up to me. At a minimum, the information needs to go where the information should go. There are organizations now that have been set up specifically to triage and analyze and assess this information. That's fact, folks. This is not supposition. This isn't 4 years ago. We have an organization set up right now, what's called AIM, now I think it's on an arrow, but we now have Congress and the executive branch engaged. We have the resources and we have the assets and the personnel to do the job. So we need to get that information, that legacy information, to the right place, let them do their job, report that to Congress, and then let Congress report to you, either vis-a-vis hearings or some sort of communique. I think it does deserve to be in the public, Brian, but that's not my decision.
Right. Bob, what's your view on the puzzle pieces? And that can be anything from a great video or radar image of a UFO, to alien bodies buried in Area 51 that we don't know where they're from or what the deal is. What kind of puzzle pieces?
Yeah, you're talking about these puzzle pieces. When I spoke at the National Press Club in 2001, 20-some years ago, there were a lot of witnesses that had pieces of them. And I'm talking about NASA people who had seen photographs of moon bases. We had radar of these objects. We had records of radar. We had a lot of information, and some of these people are still alive, by the way. And there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from existing witnesses. Put them under oath, put them in front of Congress, have an open hearing, and you're going to start to see these puzzle pieces come together into a finished mosaic.
But do you think that would also include, again, coming back to puzzle pieces, but physical pieces, not I saw, I heard, I was told,
Well,
30 years ago, because that really doesn't get us there.
okay, well, maybe it doesn't get you, but it is evidence. When you're in a courtroom, people present evidence through witness, through documents, right? We have that kind of witness testimony, like I said, put them under oath. There are supporting witnesses that will back them up. Now, is that enough evidence for you to prove something? I don't know. But you present the evidence and see what the public jury has to say.
But it would certainly be a big exercise of public transparency, no doubt about it, that the government officials know this, experienced this, saw this, and they're revealing it. So I agree with you that it would be a big step. David, I see you ready to go there.
Yeah. I often stated that I hope the government and the military knows more than we do in the civilian sector. They have the toys, they have the satellites, they have the Aegis radar system, they have the military planes that are up, they have the radar arrays, they have NORAD. I certainly hope they know more than we do in the civilian sector by virtue of the toys that they have and that they can employ. As far as quantifying the number of pieces to your question, Brian, I don't know if we really know enough to really try to quantify that. But I think that in the civilian sector, where I've often been very humble in stating, we're dealing with table scraps. We're dealing with civilian reports. We're dealing with documents that happen to be declassified or released through declassification. But admittedly, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of the data we don't have access to, and it could be for very good security reasons, based on sources, methods, etc. But I think the honest answer to your question is we don't know what we don't know. And I don't think there's any shame in saying that. To identify and acknowledge a phenomenon is enough. We have enough preponderance of evidence, to Robert's point, that there is something out there. Now, each one of us may have a different threshold as far as what constitutes proof of the reality. And each one of us here has to, formulate and decide what proof tips that scale to where it becomes fact, not speculation. But I'd be curious to get Alejandro's answer to that as well.
Well, maybe put it to you this way: how do you get from we have enough evidence, I think, to know that there is something there? In other words, the phenomenon does exist. But how do we get from there to maybe some explanations for what it is?
I think that's the battle that's going on behind the scenes that really, I think, Chris Mellon identified. And I think that's what's really important. As Chris Mellon, in his previous work, he's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense Intelligence, and he was involved with the 9/11 kind of cleanup, where the problem was all of this intelligence information was stovepiped, and there was no communication and collection of this information. And really, he's identified that same issue with this topic, is that, he feels there's probably all of these agencies with little pieces of the puzzle, like you say, but they're not working together. It's kind of like your sister grabbing a piece and running to her room, and, she's going to hide that from you. My sisters were little brats. They used to do that kind of thing. But, that's the kind of thing that he's trying to resolve. And that's where you hear a lot of the talking points coming from Congress. Of course, you've written about this quite a bit. And it's kind of a concern because, prior to the hearings, we heard from John Kirby that essentially we're starting to get these agencies to work together, and we're starting to contact some of these agencies. Some of them are getting back with us. I've had, I think, Blue's alluded to this, and fortunately I've been able to talk with some people with the UAP task force, which was the Navy side, where the smaller group, where they were making these inroads to get these organizations to work together. But that's a big deal, to get buy-in from all these agencies that have the puzzle pieces, and to figure out what agencies even have these puzzle pieces. So I think that's the big issue that Chris Mellon was trying to tackle, and is hopefully, Lou would probably know more, and maybe you can answer the question, which is hopefully happening, that these agencies are starting to get on board and hopefully begin to share their puzzle pieces so they can put that picture together. But the question comes, once they put that picture together, how much of that picture are they going to be able to share with the public? Possibly, potentially, when Chris Mellon first suggested they have hearings in an article that he wrote, I think it was the Washington Post, he suggested that, hey, I realize this is classified stuff and it probably has to stay classified. Fortunately, the response was, I think, Chris, Congress thinks you're right, but we want a public side of this. We want some transparency. But how much of that, how much transparency will we get? And Lou just did a whole lecture today on how some of this information is not going to come out. I think that's why things like NASA getting involved, with SCU, we're pure science and we're all about transparency, which is what science has to work like that. If you talk to some of the people who have worked on black projects or special access programs, you have a limited amount of scientists you work with. But all of these, discoveries or research take a lot of disciplines. But let's say you've got a buddy who's working on something and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm making this discovery. Let's say even you're back engineering a craft and you're like, it looks like it's using this sort of propulsion. I've got a friend who can help me with that. It's going to cost thousands of dollars, months and months, for that person to potentially get cleared to help you on that special access program. So the science is very difficult to do in those programs, whereas someone like NASA, they can get, you know, tons of scientists internationally who can all work together on these issues. So I think once science really gets into this topic, we may get more, you know, public information about the nature of these things that way than even if the military puts all these puzzle pieces together. They may find a puzzle they're putting together is not something they want to share with the public. Maybe justifiably so.
I feel like before maybe we delve a little bit deeper into how things are changing, what are some of the dynamics, whether it's the role of Congress, whether it's the reduction of the stigma of UFOs. I feel like there's a lot we can talk about there, but one thing I do want to address that I always call sort of the elephant in the room, or the alien in the room, which is that, and I'd just be curious if everyone's take on this, but we live in a society where, whether it's through movies, popular culture writ large, there's a vast majority of Americans who believe that the government does have the answers. That, you know, that they captured aliens here in Roswell, New Mexico, 75 years ago, and they've been sitting on that secret. Others like it. How much of an impediment is that very deeply ingrained belief among so many in the public to moving forward in some of the ways you guys have described? In other words, the government can come out and say, we put more pieces of the puzzle together, and here's what we think we know. Let's say that hypothetically that would happen. How do we even have any confidence that a significant majority of the public would believe it, would buy any of it? Because there's just such a sort of multi-layered, almost scar tissue on this issue culturally. I mean, I'm one who thinks there are more puzzle pieces, but I don't believe that the alien bodies were in the ways that that was considered. But a lot of people believe that. So just sort of take a stab at how much of a problem is that if you think secrecy is over ignorance as opposed to knowledge. You must get that question all the time, right? Have you been to Wright Patterson? Have you been to Area 51?
I do. Let me start by saying this. I've said this before for the record. I do not believe classified information should be treated like a fine wine, where the longer we keep a cork on it, the better it gets. I think it's like vegetables in the refrigerator, and the longer you leave them in there, the more they start to stink, and have to clean them up at some point. I think secrets have a shelf life. I do not, repeat, do not think that the American people should be kept from the reality of UAPs. Now, how they work, what their full capabilities are. Look, if we are afraid of Russia or China back engineering that information, then I can understand keeping something classified to protect, again, going back to sources and methodology here, right? We don't want this. Can you imagine a rogue nation getting the capability to be anywhere, anytime on the face of this planet, completely undetectable? I mean, that's kind of a scary notion, right? Nobody wants some rogue nation having that. We saw what happened on 9/11. I lived through that and spent the rest of my career dealing with that event. And those were a handful of aircraft. And look what the destruction that caused our nation and the world. Now, imagine taking some technology that allows you to go anywhere at any time. That's a problem. So I can understand the government's hesitancy to not want to share that information, but the fact that UAPs exist, I don't think is a fact that should be classified. I personally think that is an abuse of the classification system. At the end of the day, it is going to work against the national interest of our country because the cat is already out of the bag. We have already admitted at the most senior levels of our government, whether it's the former director of national intelligence, several directors of the CIA, former presidents of the United States have already said for the record, yes, I've been briefed on them, they are real. So For us to try to keep that cat in the bag, I think is a strategic mistake. It's going to work against the very authority that we have placed in our government. It makes the government look incompetent, and that is not a good scenario. Now, as far as trying to, as you say, remove the scar tissue, well, look, this is a problem that I've told people before. This affects everybody equally and yet differently, depending how you were raised, maybe philosophically, theologically, sociologically, psychologically. This is a big pill to swallow, folks, and everybody's going to handle it a little bit different. There's a lot of scar tissue, and everybody's going to deal with that scar tissue just a little bit different. Some people want their pound of flesh. Some people want people held accountable. You lied to us for 70 years, and darn it, we're going to hold you accountable. Someone's going to go to jail for lying to us. Now,
But I guess my point is, lying about what?
well, I mean, they have first, they lied.
Just that they exist. You've seen them in the
Well,
past.
that there were programs, and I mean, look, you know, how long did it take for the Pentagon first said that ATIP was real, and then it said it wasn't, then it said, okay, maybe it was real, well, okay, it was real, but it wasn't like UFOs, okay, well, maybe it wasn't like UFOs, and it was real, but it wasn't really a big deal, well, okay, maybe it was a big deal, and you heard the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Moultrie, and Scott Bray, this month, say, for the record, yes, we have the ATIP information. They said that on live TV. They have our information. So before they were saying just months before that, yeah, nothing to see here, folks. So I think there is some obfuscation going on. And Brian, that's my concern, and that's why I think it's so important for folks like you in the media to keep scratching at that. Don't let that scar tissue scab over. Keep digging, because you're winning. You're getting exactly the information and the actions, and in some cases the answers you're looking for.
How about you, David? How much of a challenge for you as a researcher and archivist is the scar tissue? In other words, you must come across it all the time, right?
I do, but I think directly to your point, Brian, and I can answer this a couple different ways. Specific to the Roswell incident, for example, I think you described bodies and debris.
Yeah, I mean, some people believe that as much as they believe God was thrown in heaven.
Right, but you also, I think, use...
By which you could argue there's about as much evidence of. I mean, how do people believe it?
Well, the word that I think you used in that question was answers also. And I think what some people falsely equate is, let's just for the sake of argument say Roswell did happen as the mythology in the UFO community has created. That something crashed, bodies were recovered, debris was recovered, technology was recovered. As I've often stated, if this thing, conservatively speaking, was 1,000 years ahead of us in technology, do we really think in 75 years, as of this weekend, that we really have the wherewithal and knowledge to back engineer that? And I would argue quite possibly no. That the questions that they had in 47, if in fact something was recovered, are the same questions that are facing physicists today in trying to understand the technology. And let's again, for the sake of argument, say dead bodies were recovered. Dead bodies don't tell you where they came from. They don't tell you what their mission was. They don't tell you why they're here. So I think we have to be careful in not falsely equating recovered debris and bodies, assuming the Roswell event happened as it's been stated, with answers. And so, but on the broader context, it really touches on belief systems. I find that belief systems within the UFO field has been one of the biggest obstacles. Many of those have been self-perpetuating, not by virtue of a government agency spreading disinformation, but by gullible UFO people that develop a framework, a mythology of belief. Roswell happened, we back-engineered it, and all these triangles and other UFOs that people are seeing today are back-engineered technology that we've had for 40, 50, 60 years. And to your point, let's just say for the sake of argument, the United States government released everything that they knew about the UFO UAP subject tomorrow. How many of you would believe them? Let's say they laid it all out on the table. I would argue that a third of this room would believe it, a third of this room would completely deny it, and a third of this room would question what's really going on. Is this a false flag operation, as many people have stated? So belief systems, for us individually, but also us collectively, are one of the biggest issues facing us, even if the answers were put right in front of us tomorrow.
So since we're talking about the scar tissue of the history, I'd be curious, Bob, your take, or how you feel as someone who's been shouting effectively from the rooftops for a couple decades. And I don't want to say you were dismissed, but you obviously had a challenge getting your message out. And there were probably a lot of skeptics. Do you feel vindicated somewhat? Because there's obviously a conversation going on now that you probably wish was happening 20 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When I spoke in front of the Brazilian Senate, the first thing I said is I've been waiting 55 years to tell this story to a government body. Now, let's see, I'd like to make a couple of points. First, let me ask you a question. Have you ever read Witness to Roswell by Donald Schmidt?
Yes. Yeah.
No,
I have not.
I'm asking Brian.
I have not.
Uh-huh. Have you ever read? I think so. If you're going to be in Roswell talking about the Roswell crash, maybe you should do some homework. Have you ever read Crash at Corona by Stan Friedman?
I have not. I've read Stan Friedman stuff.
Yeah.
Alejandro recommended it.
Those are the two best books that I've read on Roswell. And they talk about many, many witnesses describing dead bodies. I mean, many. Anyway, I recommend you read those. The other point I'd like to make is I'm convinced, and I have been for a long, long time, that there is an international UFO cabal that's keeping these secrets. And this cabal is composed of individuals embedded in intel agencies and other agencies, military agencies, such as AFOSI, for example, that know these secrets and will do anything to protect the secrets and keep them from being exposed. And that includes whatever they have to do. I've heard the word obfuscate, lines, etc., etc. And they know plenty. They know plenty.
What do you think is the motive for that? Is it because we just don't think the public is ready to know this? Do we want to keep it from the bad guys? What's the primary motive for that cabal?
Well, I talk about this. I think there's, let's see, three aspects. One is greed, because these secrets are valuable. The technology that can be gleaned from these secrets is valuable. It's worth money. The second thing is secrets are power. Secrets are power, political power. And it keeps these people, these individuals ensconced in their position. Secrets can be used as bargaining chips between nations. Okay? So I think those are the main reasons. I don't think it has anything to do with how it will affect the stock market or people's belief in religion or can we handle it. None of that. It's all baloney. So we're dealing with this cabal that's ensconced not only in our country but in other nations. It's an international group. I have no doubt in my mind that it exists.
Well, I'm curious, you've piqued my interest. This cabal, can you tell us, I mean, to the extent you know or you're willing to share, the level of organization? The reason why I ask it is because I feel in the modern day, with the internet and social media and privately owned satellites and sort of this explosion and decentralization of information and technology, how does one operate, organize a cabal like that and keep it secret for so long?
All right, I have another question for you, Brian. Have you read my book?
I have.
It's called Unidentified, the UFO Phenomenon. And in there, I go into great detail on this cabal, how it's organized. So, that's my answer.
Alejandro, you want to jump in?
Cabal is a separate issue, and I think we could definitely take that as a panel if you wanted to. It's interesting. Of course, I'm
Well, we're talking about secrecy.
But I want to
It seems like a big fat secret to me.
But I think your first question was really important. which is the effect of, belief and people's belief. And I think that has been unjustifiably an excuse for the government not to do public research. In 1978, Valet warned that if you, the government, don't get involved with this or remain involved with this or begin again, because of course by then Condon had come and Blue Book was gone, then the public is going to fill the gaps themselves, to fill the gaps of knowledge. Religions are going to be born, conspiracies are going to be born, and it's going to undermine people's faith in government. And I think he was exactly correct, and that's what's happened. And, the difficulty, though, that the Air Force had, when Carter became president, he asked NASA to look into UFOs. NASA went to the Air Force kind of told them, well, the problem is it's a lose-lose situation. And I think, some of us up here can attest to this, in that, the general public is going to be, if you don't show them the alien bodies and the UFOs, they're going to think you're lying to them. On the other hand, the mainstream is going to think you're hurting your credibility by getting involved at all. So it is this lose-lose situation, and I think, I'd like to hear from others, like David especially, but because he and I have been in the front lines, well, all of us, of course, Bob as well, tackling this issue regardless, and taking the heat that, we're hiding secrets, or the opposite, that we're not credible and we're goofballs because we're looking into this topic, even though, of course, we look into it more carefully. So, yeah, it has. Just to answer that original question that you asked, I think it does have an effect. But
You mean the scar tissue?
yeah, the scar tissue has
obscures the truth.
Yeah, and it has
Obscures
delayed.
getting.
Exactly.
So I want to get back to the cabal.
The cabal.
I'd be curious, actually, just by a show of hands, how many people in the audience are at least open-minded to the notion, even if you don't know for sure, of what Bob just described, that there is an international cabal, which I define as sort of maybe I'm misdefining it, but a relatively organized, you said multinational, different countries, intelligence agencies that are sort of in on it. How many people think that's legit? All right, so maybe half the room. Or you weren't sure? You wanted to see what everybody else did first. I get it. That's interesting to me because, again, I come from a world where you could say that I drank the Kool-Aid, but I've covered the military, I've covered the CIA. The thing that I often say to even friends and family who ask me, like, tell us all about the secrets, or how does it really work? And I often will say, in my experience, and of course I've never had security clearance. I've seen some classified information here or there, but very sporadically. But my sense is that the Hollywood version of a very organized, effective, shrewd, we're pulling the wool over your eyes, all you people, kind of narrative doesn't compute with most of the people that I've come across who are average or above average Joes or Jills, like we know in our everyday lives, who are dedicated patriots. But this notion of the government, at least the US government, being so organized that they're running this conspiracy for 75 years that nobody's been able to find out about. It's a stretch for me. It's hard for me to believe that that's true, and we bitch and moan about the government not even being able to pick up the garbage. Like, which is it? Either they're feckless and ineffective, or they're not. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's a little bit of both, depending on which part of the government you're talking about. But what really puzzles me a little bit is the fact that we have countries like Russia and China, in particular, very advanced militaries, would somehow be in on this cabal with us, where we're basically at each other's throats. In every other realm of human engagement, whether it's trade, whether it's military competition, how does that work?
All right, let me ask you a question, Bryan.
I didn't hear it.
Do you think we share secrets with the Russians?
Sometimes, sure.
Sometimes. When it's in our so-called mutual interest?
Yeah, no, that's a good answer.
That's an answer to,
effective or rational answer. This could be a subject where we decide it's much more important to work together than dispute.
exactly. So I think this is one of them. So,
Lou, you've been quiet over there.
Well, when we say international cabal, what does that mean? Because, you know, we have them, they're called NATO, they're called United Nations, they're called
Five Eyes.
Five Eyes. We've been dealing with these organizations as a matter of practice and business for a long time. And I also, you know, from personal experience, you don't have to use another country to create a cabal. You can have organizations, institutions. Look, when we were fighting wars in Iraq, we used private companies like Blackwater to do a lot of our work. They were not U.S. soldiers. They were contractors. It was a private company being used to execute wartime operations in a foreign country. So we do have a long history. I think we need to be very careful and try to avoid being conspiratorial, because it's easy to go down the rabbit hole and say, yeah, the U.S. is working with a bunch of other countries to keep this all secret from everybody else, and that's why you need to know. I think that's an oversimplification. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we would choose to work with other countries and not other countries, right? There are, again, these organizations. Let's look at the World Health Organization. That's not a country, right? That is an organization. Do we work with them? Yes, we do. You know, obviously not in this capacity.
Headline, Lue Elizondo says the WHO.
Yeah, it is not. I'm taking that from you. But I'm simply
I was joking.
Please, I'm not saying that I'm working with UFOs. I'm simply using it as an example to highlight the fact that nations will partner with other organizations, countries, institutions, as it is in the best interest for those nations. And is it possible that we have used private organizations in the past to maybe do some work on the side of the government we're not comfortable with? Well, we did. Look at OSHAP, look at ATIP. We did employ private companies to do governmental type work in secret that even people in the government weren't necessarily aware of sometimes.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually a good segue to another question that I've had for a number of years now, which is there's this habit to sort of look to the government for the people that have the secrets. Oh, it must be the CIA or it must be DOD. We certainly know that, whether you mentioned Lockheed Skunk-Works that built all these secret planes, I've heard from sources on the inside that if you're asking all the questions to the government, that's great, but you need to also be asking the questions about private companies, a la TRW, which doesn't exist anymore, was, gobbled up by one of the other bigger ones, but Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, that if the government wants to hide something that is not covered under the Freedom of Information Act, it is, an institution that's very difficult to take anything loose. You would give all that stuff, all those puzzle pieces to them to hold for you as custody. So,
And they're not lying. When the government says, we're not looking at this.
we don't have that.
It's not the government. We don't have it, right?
So let's delve into that, Alejandro, a little bit. How much is that a piece of this secrecy world that we haven't really cracked fully?
I think it comes back to the government piece of it that you had mentioned before, and this idea of government, and the idea of coordination, I think, is unprecedented. That's why I don't believe in government involvement with the cabal. The major idea of MJ-12 was introduced in a hoax document by someone who admitted it was a hoax. It's a hoax. Sorry, guys, it's a hoax. It is completely a hoax. Look up Richard Doty. Look up my videos. MJ-12 is a hoax. Now we're getting into it. It's a complete hoax, but you can look into it. It's well documented. And if you don't believe that, then how can you explain that? The first time we heard about MJ-12 was in a document that is an admitted hoax, where they were trying to hoax this guy named Benowitz, who was seeing things over Kirtland Air Force Base that were, according to Richard Doty, who is the guy who admits to hoaxing, he was hoaxing this to make him think that these secret projects that he was seeing were alien. And I think this is a big issue, is that we have to follow the thread, do the research, and we gotta be sure that we don't get duped by hoaxers. You know, Stan Friedman was a big mentor of mine, and we used to debate this issue, but it was his research partner who was part of this hoax, admittedly, who came out in 1989, well after Roswell was a thing, to admit that, yeah, I was working with this Richard Doty guy to put out disinformation.
But how are you sure the international cabal didn't put him up to coming out and admitting that it was fake?
That gets back to the second part of your question, which is, if there is an international cabal, if you are working for a private company, your number one loyalty is to that corporation. That corporation's loyalty is to their shareholders. That company is going to, that's going to be proprietary technology that they own, that they're going to sell, and they're never going to share that information. If there was some sort of cabal, I don't think it would be in the government for decades. I don't think it would be Russian government working with us. The Russian government isn't even the same Russian government it was back in 1947 or when all this had begun. There's just so many pieces. It's much more nuanced and complicated than just to say, that there's these people in the government that are hiding everything. I think it would be more, if there is that sort of secrecy, corporations, and corporations aren't beholden to the American public whatsoever.
How much do you think, David, the corporation, the private industry?
I've been saying it for years, Brian. I've been saying it for years, not to negate what Robert's saying as far as government involvement, but private sector is by definition private. It is, I was going to say, but you already beat me
And it
to
matches up with Bob says it up agreed.
It's exempt. Private sectors.
We don't want to give this up because it's worth a lot of money.
Absolutely. Private sectors are exempt, as you said, rightly so, from FOIA requests. With all due respect to John Greenwald, who's a good friend and colleague, and he's done great work, you can file FOIA requests all day long. What's that going to tell you that Northrop has, or Boeing, or any of these other groups, Raytheon? It's not. It's not. I mean, you're fighting a losing battle there right out of the gate. So I've been saying for years, I think Alejandro had even stated, private sector is where I think a lot of this material and information is. And the government is the easy target, and it may be a viable target. I'm not going to sit here, I don't know. Again, my default position is I don't know. I'm not going to profess that I do. But private sector, I think, is an area that people have ignored, they have forgotten about, and there is obviously a very incestuous relationship with private sector and government, not just in this country, but in others.
And I think it should be noted that the Wilson document, which is now part of the government record due to the hearings, I'm a little skeptical of maybe everything that document says, but that document actually has a more realistic, I think, perspective, where it does say that it was private corporations, that Admiral Wilson had looked at this bigot list of who had these secrets. And Dr. Eric Davis has told me personally he believes it was even the Roswell craft, but that in this list there weren't government officials, it was corporate people on these lists that were privy to the information.
We do it on time. I do want to give time for some questions.
Yeah, please.
Maybe an hour. Maybe an hour. Where shall we go from here? I do want to delve a little bit into the nuclear, since we have nuclear. But also, as I said earlier in my talk today, I mean, as just a journalist and not a historian, who is trying to sort of educate myself as much as possible through people like Alejandro and others, but also reading books that people recommend. But I've tried to look for some patterns as well. Like, so where are there seemingly more cases of very credible reports, particularly in the military, because that's my need. And the nuclear issue comes up all the time. There's obviously the case of Malmstrom in 1967. but it's laid out today. There's others. We all know and maybe sometimes forget the most recent, most high-profile cases involving Nimitz, Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carriers have a nuclear power plant on them, nuclear power, so that's a nuclear facility. We've heard about power plants, Department of Energy, other sites like that. And even here in Roswell, I mean, you can't look at the Roswell incident and not realize or recall that 2 years earlier, the first blown up was up the road. And from what I understand, someone said earlier that there was actually nuclear weapons perhaps stored near Roswell. Very early, of course, in the nuclear age. And so, and then the last point I'll make is that one piece, or maybe even several pieces of the recent legislation that Congress has passed, is specifically identified nuclear sites as an area of particular interest. So maybe you could all weigh in on this, but just so what's your personal take on whether the nuclear issue is a key piece of the puzzle, if you will, in pulling together the bigger picture?
Lou, I'll go last.
Well, I think it's pretty clear. The data suggests there's a nuclear connection, whether it's nuclear propulsion, nuclear weapons, or nuclear technology, whether it's Department of Energy or the Department of Defense. What I can substantiate is that there is a fact, it's in my resignation letter to my friend Jim Mattis when I resigned, about the nuclear connection. Our nuclear capabilities are the crown jewels of our nation. There are few secrets that we protect like we protect our nuclear secrets. The nuclear triad is still one of the crown jewels. Make no mistake about it. And when you talk about like you mentioned, the Roosevelt or the Nimitz, let's look at what a carrier strike group actually comprises of. Well, it's not just, surprise folks, it's not just a nuclear carrier that has nuclear propulsion. You have aircraft on there that may have some sort of capabilities, if ever needed to deliver nuclear technologies somewhere in the world, weapons. You also have some nuclear-powered vessels that provide support to that carrier strike group. And then you have submarines, in some cases, that are not only nuclear-powered, but have nuclear weapons on board. In fact, you have a larger nuclear footprint in a small area of the ocean, in some cases more than the entire state of New York. So we continue to see that trend. And, you know, I'm sure Mr. Salas here can tell you better than anybody. I mean, he was there that day. It's not just our Navy equities out at sea. It's also our flights here, our nuclear missile silos here in the continental United States, and it is also, to some degree, Department of Energy facilities. If you look at DHS, Department of Homeland Security, suspicious activity reports, you know, there's a really interesting correlation there. And so I would submit to you, if we're going to spend all this time protecting our nuclear technology, then, and there's, by the way, some sort of technology that's out there that has the ability to come in and out of our controlled U.S. airspace completely undetected at will, and has the ability to actually interfere with our nuclear capabilities. Again, Mr. Salas here can tell you firsthand, then yeah, I think that's a national security priority. I think it's something we should all be a little bit concerned with, because someone's doing it. The question is who and why, right, and how. And those are the more difficult questions to get into. But that would be my perspective. And in fact, I believe in it so much that I was willing to resign my position, a very senior position in the Department of Defense, because it wasn't speculation. There was enough data that suggested that is exactly what is occurring.
David, how much in your research does that nuclear issue stick out as sore thumb?
Well, I think to Lou's point, it's obvious if you look at the data that there's a strong correlation there. Most recently in my triangular UFO research during COVID and lockdown, I was afforded a lot of time to do historical research. I went through thousands of case files from the NICAP PUFOS case file collection from 1947 to 1977. I found 102 additional historical triangle reports, one of which I actually sent to Chris Mellon because I thought he would be interested in this. It involved a triangular UFO that was reported in a local newspaper that was sighted flying over the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. I believe the year was 1965. Interesting, as I started researching the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and I'm not saying that this is the definitive answer, but I found it an interesting correlation. 1965 was the same year that the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard started working on nuclear-powered naval vessels. I believe the USS Fulton was the first vehicle that was serviced there. So I found that to be interesting and possibly just reinforcement of this idea of this nuclear connection with UFOs. And of course, we could talk about United States cases, but of course there was the Bielorussia Ukraine case in 1982, where this UFO was sighted by the villagers. It was documented by Primetime Live in the 1990s. All the villagers attested to seeing this. Colonel Platunov was the Russian officer that was in charge of the base. He attested to the fact, and Boris Sokolov, who was in charge of their Russian program, testified to this. I believe it was a 5-man commission was sent after this UFO was hovering overhead, and the missile started to go into a pre-launch sequence for several seconds before it shut down, that the Soviet military wanted to look at. I believe it was one of the more serious Soviet military cases, if I'm not mistaken, that they looked at. And they tore that launch control panel apart piece by piece and found nothing to be out of order. The only assessment they could determine was some external force, fill in the blank with whatever you want, exerted some influence on that launch site. And so it's not just the United States where we've seen this, it's international as well.
And of course, there are cases, and Bob knows this better than anyone, but I've read about cases in the UK, the US-based nuclear weapons, 70s, another one in Korea, I believe, maybe it was in the 80s. I may be misremembering, but Bob, tell us, how much do you know or have researched about cases sort of since the one that you mentioned? In other words, is it your sense that they're continuing to happen at nuclear facilities, whether it's SDM bases or other places?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me go back to 1944, and this brings back the U.S. Navy. They had a station in Pasco, Washington, and they had pursuit aircraft there. On radar, they detected this object flying over Hanford Nucleus, where plutonium was being processed for the first bomb. This didn't happen just once, it happened at least twice. And we have witness testimony to that effect. So this was even before the first bomb.
So it coincides with the beginning of the nuclear age?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then here in Roswell, what we now call the Walker Air Force Base. Again, I talked about Jerry Nelson, Lieutenant Jerry Nelson, who was in charge of the Atlas site, and many times saw UFOs. So UFOs have revisited Roswell many times. So as far as more recent, I've heard as recently as 2018, again at Malmstrom, 2010 at Princess E. Warren. So, yes, we're still concerned that we have nuclear weapons.
Well, if we're all agreeing, or you're all agreeing that there's a pattern, there's a data supports this pattern, I don't want to get too much into theorizing, but it seems like the next rational question would be why nuclear facilities? In other words, whoever they are, whatever it is, why do you think they'd be so innately?
Well,
or is it obvious?
I think it's obvious. Nuclear weapons are not weapons of war, they're weapons of mass destruction, complete and total destruction. We are living in a time right now, at this moment, where there is a serious threat of nuclear war. Why? Because Russia has tactical nuclear weapons. They have another 2,000 nuclear weapons ready to go, strategic missiles and land, sea, and air, and subs, etc. They are at war with Ukraine, and Putin is about, he's not going to lose the war. Pakistan and India are both nuclear powers. Since the U.S. left Afghanistan, they're right next door to Pakistan. They have relations with Pakistan. So we've got the threat that some radical group in Afghanistan might get a hold of these weapons, one way or the other.
And of course, Iran.
And then Iran.
So,
Right. Iran can develop nuclear weapons, and if they do, probably Saudi Arabia will want nuclear weapons. So this idea of nuclear deterrence does not work. Yeah, up to now, it's apparently we haven't had another nuclear blast, of course, but in wartime. But if the threat is growing, the number of countries will grow, and somehow these weapons will get into the wrong hands or be used by mistake or for whatever reason. There we go. We're on our way. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take long to have an all-out nuclear war, and that's why we really should give this high precedence and push for abolishment of all nuclear weapons.
Not to. Not to put words in your mouth, but is it fair to say that you think, because of what you just described, some entity is monitoring, watching, maybe even warning, shutting them off at times, is very concerned about what you described for the
Yeah, I'd say that they're concerned for us and for them too. We don't know how nuclear war would affect them.
Lue.
Yeah, I would respectfully, I agree that nuclear weapons are terrible, but I would respectfully disagree with Mr. Salas in that assessment. And I say that simply because in World War II, 1945, we vaporized 500,000 living souls off the face of this planet, and nowhere did UFOs stop that. In fact, nowhere did UFOs come in, stop our development of going from the A bomb to the hydrogen bomb to the nuclear bomb to the thermonuclear bomb. They didn't stop testing in the 50s and the 60s in the desert. They did not stop China, Russia, or any other country from developing nuclear weapons. In fact, when we started this journey in 1945, there was only one country on the planet that had nukes. Now it's prolific and around the world. And as much testing as we have done, the Russians, the Indians, Pakistanis, North Koreans, Iran, and a few others, we haven't seen any interruption in this nuclear proliferation. In fact, it's only sped up. And furthermore, in Russia, they were turned on, where here they were turned off. And so I don't see any evidence that they're here for humanitarian reasons. I don't see any reason to suggest they're trying to interfere with the Korean War, Vietnam, world hunger, or COVID, or any other type of calamity facing our species. I tend to look at this a little bit more from a national security perspective. I look at this as an issue of technology development, because a species that understands nuclear technology may be on the precipice of understanding a far more profound technology. In essence, once we understand a certain technology, we now no longer are relegated to this planet, and we can do what the magicians do, possibly. Perhaps, and this is just mere speculation, perhaps any species that gets to a certain point of technological development is a blink of an eye away from now having the ability to warp space-time and perhaps traverse the universe. And let's face it, folks, we're not very likable species. We're pretty violent. We do a lot of bad things to each other. And
So from that perspective, the national security issue is maybe they're worried about us as being a national security threat.
I think there's just as much information to suggest that maybe they're just as worried about us as we're worried about them, perhaps.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I'm not sure what Lou disagrees with what I said, but I never claimed that ET was going to save us from nuclear war or any other war or stop COVID or anything else. I think they're here as far as nuclear goes to warn us the devastation that it's up to us, really. It always has been up to us to somehow avoid that. So unless I don't really understand what Lou's complaining about what I said.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think nukes are bad, for sure. That I agree wholeheartedly.
Will you take any questions?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think unless anybody wanted to add something, let's use the last 40 minutes and go deeper down the rabbit hole.
Well, when you were talking about the cabal, whether it's mainly private industry, private corporations, they're keeping the secrets, I'd like you to address the matter of Gary McKinnon. If he's extradited here, the government wants to put him in jail for 70 years, tapped into NASA, Pentagon's computer system, looking for information about UFOs, and found that one of the interesting things that he found lists of non-terrestrial officers. And so if the government isn't participating in cabal and doing whatever they can to hide these secrets, why do they want to put Gary McKinnon in jail for 70 years?
Alejandro, you seem to suggest later,
Well,
do you know the case?
I do. I've written about this, and I've written about what he had discovered. And, you know, what he had allegedly found while he was drunk and stoned, deciding to hack into government computers. What he got into was akin to computers at locations where he was using, like, password and, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These weren't, like, highly secure computers, and he was getting into, very low level sort of classifications. And he says he was too drunk and stoned to think about downloading them. So, I mean, we have this one person's alleged information. And in fact, when they went to bust him, and they were gonna, I forget what the charge was. It was gonna be like a slap on the wrist. And he said, no, I've got all your secrets. I'm gonna tell the world your secrets if you try to bust me. And they said, go for it. He did, and now he's facing extradition and much longer time in jail. So I don't think there's much there.
What is extraterrestrial officer?
It depends on what he found and what he was allegedly reading or even believing he was reading while he was drunk and stoned hacking these computers, which is his word. So you can
Maybe
make
that's
that
just
in
his defense. But
the thing is to take the word of someone that he potentially saw extraterrestrial, personnel in these computers, and then jump to the conclusion the government must be hiding that they have spacecraft with personnel, and this drunk stone guy accidentally ran across the manifest of the people in this secret spacecraft. I mean, I think that's a big leap. It's beyond hearsay. It's and it's not that substantial as evidence. I don't think is that actually occurred, or that he found that list, or that list had anything to do with personnel that we have that are either extraterrestrial or in serving our country in an extraterrestrial spacecraft.
Lou, have you ever heard the term non-terrestrial officer?
No, but we do have something called the ISS, and technically they are non-terrestrial while they are in orbit.
The International Space Station.
Right. So I mean, we do have non-terrestrial technology, that's a fact. It's, when I say non-terrestrial, it's just
It's not on the ground.
It's not on the ground. So, the government, and I forgive me because I'm talking out of ignorance here, I don't know the specifics of this, but in the government, when we want, I can tell you both on classified and non-classified systems, you won't see terms like that typically in any type of database because there's always a risk of hacking that always occurs. And anybody who's spent any time in the U.S. government will tell you we have safeguards and measures, and we have usually codes. I mean, look at ATIP, right? I mean, it's AATIP. Now you have the, AOISIG office, and now AARO. You're not going to see. You don't typically see a term like extraterrestrial personnel. you would see usually an acronym or a code, and only those people that have access to that program will know what those are. And that's kind of a governmental thing. We'd love to do that. And I'm not saying in this case that's what happened. I don't know, because I don't know anything about it. So with all due respect, sir, you could be 100% correct. What I'm simply saying in general terms, when we are using intelligence databases, classified databases, we usually have code names, and those code names are specifically for that reason, so someone on the outside can't hack. I'll also tell you too, classified systems are not connected to the internet. So we have something called NIPRNet, which is the unclassified protocol network for unclassified information, which is connected, and people have hacked that before. Then you have something called SIPRNet, which is a secure internet protocol network, which is for usually secret information. And then you have something called JWICS. JWICS is usually a much more secure system. There's other systems I won't get into here, but those are not connected generally to the internet. There's no SPL gateway that exists. It's very, very hard. You can't, in essence, you can't access the internet from those type of systems, and it cannot be accessed from the internet because they are different networks. There is no hard wires connecting them so somebody could necessarily tunnel through. And the reason why people like Edward Snowden were so dangerous is because they took information that was resident. They never just hacked into it with their laptop. They took information that was resident on a classified system and removed that information, what we call air gapping. And then that's what later on will be uploaded to the internet. But again, back to this question.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know anything about the case, but when I hear 70 years for being drunk and stoned and claiming to find aliens in government systems, it does make you wonder, why 70 years? Why are they throwing a book at him? But we can all Google that when we get home tonight. We come back and report.
They're serious about getting him as Julian Assange.
It seems that way, especially when I extradite him.
Equated. They said he did $700,000 worth of damage to the Pentagon systems.
Other questions? Ma'am.
Well, my question's for you. When you were asking about that, when Bryan was asking about the puzzle pieces and the secrecy, you said we need to start addressing this problem. And I'm wondering if you can clarify if the problem is the secrecy in and of itself, or if there's, the way you said it, it made me think like there's some specific danger with the actual UFOs that more people need to be aware of.
Well, this topic, we've got a lot of problems. Let me start, if I can, digressing for a moment. One of the problems is exactly what you see here. You see 5 middle-aged men sitting up here. Where are the women, right? Where are sisters? Where are the young people? Why is this? This is a problem. Okay? So within this community, we need to do a much better job, I think, of getting more people involved, resources, individuals, sharp minds to have this conversation. So that's an internal problem. That's not really a secrecy issue. That's an internal problem to us. I think, we don't represent necessarily the UFO community, but yet here we are. So I think the table needs to be bigger. I think we need to have a lot more people on this table.
In Politico, we wouldn't call this a panel, we would call it a manel. Which are hard. I mean, if we have an event, we go out of our way, like, you gotta get more diverse perspectives.
No, I think it's important because that comes with different perspectives and opinions. Like I said, this table, this table should be round. Okay, so we're not speaking to you. We're all speaking.
Actually, it should be oval.
And then there's the issues of secrecy, right? And the issues of government, everything from fraud, waste, and abuse to inefficiencies, and is it necessary to have a robust bureaucracy, or do you want something very light and nimble to handle this issue? And there's arguments for both. Sometimes you want a big cumbersome bureaucracy because you've got a lot of checks and balances, right? You don't want someone to single-handedly have the keys to the kingdom by themselves and make unilateral decisions, because that's why we're in the boat we are in today. Because so few people know about it that nobody knows. So that's a problem. But at the same time, if it becomes so big and so cumbersome, then you get mired down a lot of times. It's paralysis by analysis. And we want to be mired in the mud. And we get no progress that way too. So there's a lot that needs to happen here. And one of the big things, I think, and this is probably not answering your question, I think the more of us that get engaged, and I put me in this category because I'm now a civilian, the more of us that get involved in this conversation, the better chance we have of providing a recommendation and ultimately a solution. The reason why Congress, the only reason, make no mistake, the only reason why Congress is paying attention is because you're paying attention. That's a fact. And so it's working, it's happening. There's a lot of problems. The good news is we've also come a long way in the last 4 years. We really have, if you look in the last 70, now look just in the last 4, we've come, and a lot of that's due to people like Mr. Salas coming out and having the conversation. You know, poor guy was beating his head for decades, and you know, now it turns out people are like, oh wow, you were right. Well, yeah, he was right. You know? And so were a lot of other people. And so I think we need to the problem begins with us first. We need to look in the mirror. What's wrong with UFO advocacy today? Okay, and then fix that. And then we need to take that and we need to go to whether it's our representatives. You know, the media's done a very good job in the last 4 years. Running a hell of a lot of risk into this topic. As a mainstream media journalist, a national security correspondent for none other than Bill Craig, right? I mean, who in their right mind 4 years ago would even want to write an article on this? It'd be suicide, professional suicide. And yet, he and a few others stepped out and said, you know what, it's important enough where I have to at least report on it. These are the facts. Let's talk about the facts. So the bright side of this is that a lot's happened. You know, but when you say where you have to fix the problem, there isn't the problem. There isn't a problem. There are lots of problems. And really, it kind of starts with ourselves to some degree. You know, but I look around this room and I see all sorts of individuals and some very, very smart, intellectual individuals. People a hell of a lot smarter than me, that's for sure. You know, if I was still running agencies, I'd probably recruit half of them. I mean, the landscape has changed significantly. We've really come a long way, but we also have a lot further to go. We really do. Great news is that we started that journey. Bad news is, we're not quite there yet, kids, right? Are we there yet? Not yet. Often are we there yet? Not yet. So I think we're kind of in that situation personally.
You know, since you dragged me into it, I will disagree a little bit, or maybe not disagree, but add one more thing to your point about Congress acting because they feel like there's a public demand. I actually kind of disagree with that. I think the lessening of the stigma of the topic has led some members of Congress who were innately interested in it to feel like there's much less political risk to do it. I don't think they're getting lots of calls. I may be wrong, but you know, their constituent line at their congressional office isn't ringing off the hook about UFOs. It's ringing off the hook about gas prices and all kinds of other things. But it's a way of saying, I think one way to push it over the goal line might be if you also had much more public engagement, where members of Congress were feeling the heat. People in Washington now start to talk about the UFO vote. In other words, is there some benefit politically to talking openly about UFO? Where you might get young people and others who might not be interested in politics to engage. So I don't know what you're saying is wrong, but I think there's another side of it.
No, I agree with you, Brian.
Which is, you know what, I want to know where Area 51 is, and now I'm on the Intelligence Committee, and it doesn't seem like there's that much of a risk to talk.
No, I think you're right. I think there's both, and I do think you're right that Congress now feels it's acceptable to have this conversation because they're not going to get the hate mail from their constituents, right? So they feel it's safe to have this conversation and to try to get to the bottom of this. And I think there's actually now an expectation, you know, to some degree with the beginnings of these new hearings that we just saw.
Question, how about the gentleman all the way in the back with the hat?
Yes, thank you. Just quick point, going back to Captain Salas' point about the cabal. I feel like there's a big, maybe willful ignorance, I feel in the mainstream media when it comes to separating the private sector from elected officials. Just that they were completely separate entities. And I feel like a lot of times we pretend like the money that takes for them to get elected doesn't come from the private sector. And maybe that's part of the, you know, like you like to say, the alien in the room. It's the fact that maybe they're all connected at one point. It's not necessarily government is too competent to get this done, it's maybe just the private sector, but maybe it's a combination of both, because the private sector, you know, it's absolutely involved in government. They are, for example, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's you can look it up on Google. Literally, they get together. They're big companies that are aiming for elected representatives to present laws and pass laws for the benefit of these corporations. So why would that be different in the sense of Lockheed, Boeing, the ones that are in charge of, you know, benefiting from keeping the energy that's powering the UFOs or whatever, right? Keeping that away from the public. Why would that be such a mystery? When in fact the very politicians, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are getting their money to run for office from the big corporations.
I'll sort of pass this along to a couple of panelists, but my quick answer to that, as someone who's covered the military-industrial complex for much of my career, I do think you're right when we in the media don't maybe do a good enough job of explaining the relationship between the two. In other words, the government says this, the private industry says this, when often they are really not the same entity, but very much intertwined. I did a series about 10 years ago when I was at the Boston Globe where I tracked every retired 3- and 4-star general for 30 years, what they did after they left the military. And it went from about 30% to 90% went completely into the defense industry, either as a consultant, lobbyist, defense company executive. And it was striking because, you know, somebody I quoted in the article, a retired general, called it the commercialization of the officer corps. That Eisenhower would roll over in his grave if he knew the extent to which the conveyor belt runs between the two. And often the glue is actually the senior military officer corps. That's the glue. And then, of course, as you're pointing out on the political side, there's the money, the PACs that all of these defense companies have that fund Democrats, Republicans. It doesn't even matter really what their views are on defense. They want to make sure they know that we're number 2 or 3 or 4 contributor. So I think you're right. We should do a better job of explaining that this is not the government over here and the industry over here. Here's the way they have a lot of common interests, including to keep things potentially secret. But anybody, maybe David, maybe, I don't know how much you get into this.
Not too much, but I would just completely agree that there's obviously influences that are bidirectional in nature. That these are not mutually exclusive groups that are operating independently of one another. And obviously that changes over time. I think we can even go back to Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes had a lot of government contracts. He was a private billionaire with lots of investments, but he had very close ties to some of the defense industry. And that's just one early example, and certainly there's some that are probably going on today that we're completely unaware of, but there's clearly influence there to your point. I think it's a valid point to bring up. We aren't discussing it in rudimentary terms where we're talking about A and B, but truly there is overlap, some might argue collusion between these groups. If you're waxing conspiratorial, that might be the term you use. But yeah, absolutely to your point, it's a valid point I think you bring up.
I think about it. Have you went on this?
I read somewhere, government document actually, there are about 1.2 million in government and industry that have security clearances, high-level security clearances, and the majority of those are in industry. So yeah, there is a whole web of secrecy there. In collusion.
That's an interesting point, that security clearance, that there's more actually in the private sector than there is in the government because they're working on government contracts.
Although, you know, ALEC is kind of giving marching orders, right? And bills. Don't read it, sign it, pass it.
Tell me, what is ALEC?
It's kind of like a conservative kind of hack, but they also provide, like they'll literally write bills, send them out, and those bills will get passed without much review. So it's kind of they're a coordination kind of effort to put together or push certain political agendas. But they're open in that these are political agendas that are public political agendas because people see those bills, there's people that follow Alec. So this would be a little different in that. And the other aspect is that this would be lobbying for government officials to break the law. And I think that that's a really important component as well. So for instance, that Wilson document, which is kind of along the lines we were talking about where, you know, it was, it's this allegedly private corporation giving money to back engineer crashes. But if that's happening, and you know, this admiral allegedly, who's part of that chain of command, like Lou talked about, people who don't have to report up to the chain of command, if that's happening, then they are shirking congressional oversight, and they're breaking the law in a very important manner. I mean, I think that's part of your interest is following this story to see if that sort of thing happens. Because if there are those type of things happening, that's going to be very revelatory, and it's going to be a big scoop for Bryan, and you're going to hear it all over the place. But so it is a big deal. I mean, it's these sort of things that are getting into Congress right now, even with the nuclear thing. Now that they've been asked about it, Gallagher is the one who asked both of these questions. Now that they've been asked about it, they're probably going to have to address it. What are they going to do? Are they going to dismiss it? Are they going to debunk it? You know, are they going to just ignore the work that ATIP already did or their own files? If you look at Special Report 14, Project Blue Book, there's concern over this issue. So they're really being faced with some pretty tough decisions, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they react or what's discovered down the road, because that's the sort of thing that the amnesty will be for, is yeah, I oversaw this project, I okayed that money going to this program, but I did so for X, Y, Z reason, and that's the type of information we want to hear at this hearing, if that's going on.
Yeah, I'm going to give a slightly different perspective. I agree with all the panelists up here thus far on their opinions on this, but I am a product of national security, and there's been a long relationship, dare I say, marriage between the defense industrial base, what we call the DIB, right, the Lockheeds and the Boeings and whatnot, and the U.S. government. But let me give you an example of why we do it. We do it because we have, as a people, have decided we want to do business that way. So what do I mean by that before everybody starts jumping off and throwing tomatoes at me? Let's take surveillance, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Let's talk about the global war on terror. You have a Predator aircraft that is designed, built, serviced, fueled by contractors. It is flown by one Air Force individual, one blue suiter, military blue suiter that's part of the military, and yet that entire platform, its capabilities, and its track record is entirely done and performed those duties by civilian contractor personnel. So that was a decision made because the government realized we can get more bang for a buck rather than hiring 100 Air Force personnel to do all those, which also require the same life insurance and hospitalization and medical insurance and everything, all that stuff. By the way, you own them for 20 years. It's a lot cheaper for us to go out and outsource that. I can pay company X half that amount of money, fire them tomorrow if I need to, right? And they can perform the services for us. So it gives the U.S. government a lot more flexibility. The problem is that's when abuses can happen too, because it's easy for the government to get lax. And that oversight just stop and say, you know what, we don't know what's happening over there. We just know we need to fly this bird. And you know, Joe, does it fly? It flies great. We don't care what happened, right? Meanwhile, there's millions of dollars being funneled hypothetically, you know, that are being wasted. So that's where it gets tough. When we start, you know, what I don't want to do is demonize unnecessarily the defense industrial base because they do a lot of things right. And I also don't want to demonize the U.S. government because they do a lot of things right. The problem is sometimes you can have abuses. And that's why you have things like fraud, waste, and abuse programs within the U.S. government. The problem is when you're talking about UFOs and UAP, potential involvement in UFOs, you're talking about technology that may be so sensitive and so secret that nobody knows, and therefore there's no oversight. Normal regulatory organizations like Office of Management and Budget, OMB, Circular A11, these things that require us to look at performance assessment rating tool and things like that, I'm not going to bore you with, but these are requirements we have to fall in line with. Well, in these super secret black programs, not so much. There is no oversight like that. And this was what Chris Mellon was so frustrated, because as the SAP, as the guy who owns all the SAPs, there were still things going on that he didn't know was going on. And that's a problem, because he is the guy in charge of it. And when the guy in charge doesn't know what's going on in his own barn, the farmer doesn't know what's going on in his own barn, that's problematic, because that's where things begin to fail. That's where the bureaucracy begins to break down. So I just wanted to add that. I know it's a little boring, the topic, but I think we need to be careful. We don't need to be marching with torches and saying, yeah, bad defense industrial base, bad government. That's not the case. It does a lot of things right. But because of that structure and the decision we made to outsource a lot of the stuff, these are the potential repercussions of some of those decisions.
But it is a lot about money, I think, Bob alluded to this. And first Secretary of Defense I ever covered once told me, he said, if you want to understand the Pentagon, you need to understand one thing. And I was like waiting for this great answer. And he said, it's the largest socialist economy outside of China. In other words, the powerful interests in the private industry always get their piece, whether we need it or not, or they had the best proposal or not, and they may lose this big contract, but they're going to get the next one.
That's right.
And
Why they
it's
need to
true.
invest? We wanted 10 F-22s, and instead they decided to buy 40 F-16s. And the mission wasn't, F-16 couldn't even do the mission we asked it to do. And that's exactly the point, because at some point, you know, these big organizations are not going to fail. They employ too many people. We can't afford to have them fail. So you've kind of keep them fed somehow. And you're right, unfortunately. That happens.
How about this guy, that guy? But you were the alien shirt.
I was very happy that I heard that the military or government or whoever has decided that UFOs are real. Okay, I was really? It's taken 75 years. And after all, we are in Roswell. So I'm just curious, up with the panel, is there anyone that does not believe that the alien crashed in Roswell?
I would say, personally, I'm not 100% that happened, that it was alien, and I have read the books, and I've debated the people who wrote the books. I've known the people who write the books, and I'm great friends with people who have written the books. But here's the thing, a couple of things. If something crashed, it's just typically things are more complicated. If there was a crash and it was technology that was superior to ours, it doesn't necessarily mean for sure it's alien. The whole alien thing did not get introduced to the Roswell mythos until the mid-1980s, after Roswell was becoming a huge thing in the early 80s, when after Stanton did his work and Bill Moore wrote his book.
Springfield,
But that's different. That
1950s, aliens.
Springfield wrote like one paper. That's different than what we're experiencing now, or what was experienced in the 80s and after, with Roswell becoming extremely popular. Roswell isn't even in the Blue Book files. It was not a big case until the 1980s, when Stanton Friedman essentially refound it. You're right, Springfield had written something on it, but it didn't catch on even with the UFO community. Nobody really paid attention to it.
Why does it matter whether he caught on? He talked to people that were involved in the alien autopsy in the 1950s. I personally
But
spoke
not with
some of
Roswell.
with some of the people who were
Okay.
on the base that before they died, they said, yes, they guarded the alien bodies, they were alien bodies. The testimony in the books that you've read, it floods those books.
It does not flood those books. There are very handful of people who, either on their deathbed, told a family member that they remember something like that. Even Walter Hott had said that on his deathbed, but even his family and close friends don't believe that because that was not his story the entire time, and they believe that, you know, again, UFO researchers with a set worldview coaxed him into that. So the point is, you can talk to the Marcel family. They make this point very clear. Our father, who was the one who found this material, which of course you know, and he did, I highly recommend Paul David's movie. It's a well-done movie with
Speaking twice tomorrow for those of you who haven't.
But regardless, I know Paul David very well too, and known him for years as well. He does magic tricks too, they're great. But regardless, the alien thing didn't come into it wasn't a part of Roswell at the beginning. It was crashed materials. So I think we just have to be careful. We don't know what those materials were. We can't say for sure that there were aliens. I mean, there's a lot of questions out there, and we have to rely more than just on hearsay. There's a lot of hearsay on a variety of topics. I personally agree that the analogy that Bryan had brought with, you know, there's evidence for other, you know, there's anecdotal information for a lot of different ideas that we can't prove or we don't have any physical evidence for. So the problem is you follow the data.
I just read the Roswell Daily Record of July 8th, which had a great, you know, sensational headline, Flying Saucer Crashes at Roswell. And then if you actually read the lead of the story, it was all about a weather balloon. And I only say that, because, not because I'm saying that report was true, but as somebody who's written a couple books too now about this topic, I've always tried to go to the primary sources as much as possible. The reports within hours of the event, particularly if it was an event that happened a long, long time ago, and in the ensuing days and weeks and months. And I also know that you can pick up the New York Times today and you can read a story about something that happened yesterday, or go on their website and read about something that happened today. And probably 70% of that story is accurate. And 30% was lost in translation. Somebody explained it this way, somebody explained it that way. It got sort of amalgamated into this. And so it's hard for me as a journalist to take anyone's testimony, particularly if they don't have a photo or they don't have a verifiable piece of physical evidence, if it's years later. Even if they were there. I mean, you know, Richard Nixon wrote a memoir, and it's a great read, but about 80% of it conflicts with stuff he wrote in his own notebooks 20, 30 years before. People have selective memories, and it doesn't mean that all that stuff that you're talking about is wrong, but I think you gotta be skeptical, unless you were there. Physically, personally, we're there.
The worst thing you can do as a journalist or a scientist is be set on what the answer is before you even do your investigation. And the investigation, I don't think, is complete. But hopefully one day we will have a certain.
But we should, to answer the gentleman's question, we should quickly just do the yes or no.
I don't think they're willing to.
I'm a don't know, because I haven't read your book yet. I'm not ruling out that an alien craft could have crashed here and there were bodies and the government covered it up and all of that. I don't know. It would take a lot more convincing for me and clearly reading a lot of books. But you, yes or no, you're obviously no. Or you're
No, I'm a maybe. I don't think we know yet.
all right, maybe. You're a yes or
Maybe not.
on the
So
sort of.
I only get to say yes or no, you guys talk about it for a half hour. Something wrong here.
Give us a long answer. I was just trying to, specifically get this.
All right, my answer is, I don't have a T-shirt that says, I want to believe. This is not about belief. or what I think, any of that. There's plenty of evidence, plenty of evidence that Roswell happened. Not only was there one crash, there were two crashes. I have met and talked at length with Jesse Marcel Jr., who most of you know was a helicopter pilot. He was a medical officer, fought in the Iraq War, and he did see artifacts when his father brought them to him, as you'll see in Paul David's movie. Anyway, it's not a question of whether I believe Roswell happened. I am convinced it happened based on the evidence I've seen, evidence from those two books I mentioned, and all the other testimonials. If you go to the library at the Roswell Museum, you'll see a lot of testimony there from, including affidavits, by the way, of people that were there. So that's my answer.
That's a good answer. David?
For
I
30
guess yes, no, maybe, or in between.
Well, for 32 years, I've been hearing impassioned people talking about Roswell, pro that it happened, con that it didn't happen, somewhere in the middle it was a military test that went awry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You touched on it, Brian. I was not there when Roswell happened. So this gets into the argument one could say about God. When people say, I know God exists, you believe God exists. You can't demonstrate and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And no offense, I don't mean to offend anyone's religious sensibilities in saying that, but we have to make a distinction between belief and knowledge. And I'm not saying that it didn't happen. The issue I have is, and I've read most of the books, many of these Roswell researchers lead you to believe that, and I don't mean this in a nefarious way, that it's a cohesive story and all the pieces fit together wonderfully. Well, Frank Hoffman was one of the witnesses. He turned out that he was lying. They proved that beyond a shadow of a doubt. He wasn't who he said he was. The claims that he made were not substantiated. Mrs. Proctor, and this was based on the Fund for UFO Research, Mrs. Proctor, one of the very first people to see some of the debris that Mac Brazel collected before he brought it into Roswell, stated it looked like balsa wood and tinfoil. And she said, and there was even tape with like colored symbols on it. Well, again, I'm not saying that's what it was, but that correlates with the mobile balloon where they used Scotch tape that had purple symbols. This is not me saying this is Mrs. Proctor. So you can call me crazy, you can say I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm simply stating some of the witnesses say things that are contradictory to the official narrative, the belief. Is that saying Roswell didn't happen? No. But we need to be judicious with each and every statement, with each and every person's claim. And it is not this easy.
And also the further away from the incident in space and time that they're saying.
Absolutely. Second, third hand, fourth hand witness testimony. But I'm an agnostic. I wasn't there. So I can't sit here and say it did happen. I can't say it didn't happen. Or something in the middle. And I think there's a lot of passion when we have these discussions. Paul, I can sense your passion there. But I think we need, in any of these situations, to suspend this and try to focus more on this and try to be objective and try to come together and have a dialogue without the impassioned, not that we're arguing today, Paul, but I have, obviously there have been arguments over the decades with researchers, with Stan and Phil Klass, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to make a very brief reply to what you said.
Sure.
No member on a jury in this country, the 12 people that sit in judgment, ever was there to see the knife, see the murderer stab the victim.
But you have a
And
victim.
they evaluate all the evidence.
But you have the
They make a
victim.
decision. The evidence that Bob Salas has seen and studied for years,
Sure.
and me too. If I was on the jury, case closed. It happened. You guys are having very, very selective vision about which of the. Go
No.
into the library and look at all the affidavits of the military people that were there, and they tell you every piece of the story.
Paul, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but you just used an analogy that I think is a false analogy. We can go to the morgue and see the body that was stabbed, and more than likely the police collected the weapon that actually committed the murder.
Doesn't tell you who did it.
No.
The jury has to
No,
decide
no,
that.
no, no. The fingerprints give you a preponderance of evidence.
But there's evidence that the jury can see. And where the evidence, and again, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but we in the civilian sector have no physical evidence to look at, i.e. spacecraft bodies. Now, it could have been sequestered by the government, I'm not denying that, but I think that's a false analogy to say, well, then that, you know, someone was murdered, but they didn't see the murder happen, therefore the murder didn't happen, or you can't prove it.
What about the glove that did it?
Well, let me put the
We must do
question,
it.
I'm going to put the question to you. That's whether the story, as we're hearing it here, of what happened in Roswell, whether it happened or not, does it matter going forward, one way or the other?
Brian, would you look at the time?
In other words, you know, a lot of this community is fixated on this incident.
So let me.
Does it really matter 75 years later if we want to move forward and try to find
So let me see if I can wade into the Shark Tank here. Thanks for leaving me the last one. Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I believe, okay? And I've made this very clear from day one. And you shouldn't give a damn what I believe either, okay? What matters is what you think. I was a special agent my entire career. Collect the truth, speak the truth. That's it. And present that evidence to a jury. And it's up to what the jury thinks, not what Lue Elizondo thinks, what you think that means. What we do know are the facts. Something happened. What was it? We don't know. Something happened that caused a government reaction to go do something here in and around the Roswell area. Okay, that fact has been substantiated. Well, we can all agree with that. I'm sorry? Yeah, we would all agree with that. Yeah, I think so, absolutely, right? The question is, what happened after? Well, I don't know. And more importantly, if I were to give you an opinion, it would be a disservice. Because what's going to happen is someone here is going to listen to what I have to say and say, well, Lue Elizondo says this, so therefore, and that's wrong. Because it doesn't matter what Lue Elizondo says. Okay? What matters is what do the facts say? What does the data suggest to that jury? Exactly the jury he's talking about. Fair-minded, 12 rational human beings that can look at data and say, but not all men either. You know, and sometimes juries change their minds based upon new evidence. Okay? And that is what we need to be prepared for, right? Because the moment you make a decision based upon impartial data, then you're wrong. And I'm wrong.
The government finally admitted that they're real.
Yes, sir.
That's a pretty big piece of evidence.
It's huge.
I actually disagree with that. If you go, I haven't gone through the files of Blue Book. The government admits in Blue Book that there's a category of sightings that we can't explain. I mean, they admitted unidentified flying objects of unknown origin before I was born. Did they do it in as public way as they have now? I think this notion that they have never acknowledged the possible existence of an unknown entity that we can't explain, this simply doesn't match the historical record, right? It simply doesn't. There are memos, there are pages and pages of stuff. We don't know what the hell this thing is. People said this and that and the other thing. Is that not admitting UFOs? How is that different
Yeah, they said there were
dramatically from that?
UFOs, and then they gave two answer condons. There's no scientific knowledge we can gain from the research, which is silly. And then the second one, they don't constitute a national threat, which is also kind of silly. We don't know what they are. They're flying around, but they're not bothering us.
I think we're not going anywhere, so we can keep going, right, for another 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You okay? Question for Bob.
We hear about the UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call it, hanging out around nuclear bases, nuclear power plants. We also hear about them hanging out around earthquake areas, volcanoes, and lightning storms. Has anybody looked to see if there's more at any of these other things than there are at nuclear, or is this like just something they're going to recharge their batteries or, you know?
Well, why I can't answer, but absolutely there are people looking at why or observing these objects going into volcanoes, into mountains. I've talked to other people and who claim to have seen this. You know, credible people. I know credible people that say that there are bases underwater where UFOs are. So yeah, this is a very multifaceted phenomenon, very complex. We don't have all the answers, of course, but these phenomena are observable. They have been observed. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I was somehow worried we wouldn't be able to fill 2 hours. Let's take a vote. Do you guys want to keep going for a few more minutes? Maybe think.
I'll go on.
Let's take 3 more. 1, 2, and you go first, then we'll get the other 3 here, and then we'll be done. What?
Oh, we've got to stop.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
All right, so let's hear from our panel.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.